think the Dick Van Dyke Show reflected its era?
Well, I think it did in the manner that it derived its levels of comedy from what was vulnerable at the time. I mean, what was happening. They were a little ahead of themselves. I mean, as I said in the original thing, the original show we did about the black couple, that was, oh my God, that's... Joanna, get out of here. You're distracting my reveries.
I'll be back.
Don't come back too early. We're busy. We're running tape here. Get out of here.
I'll be back.
I have too much respect for my wife, too.
Okay, we're back on.
The Van Dyke Show reflected the time that it was in by opening the doors to the time where it was going, I think. It like with the black couple coming in and making the white couple the butt of a joke. It was like, you can't do that, but you can. And we dealt with issues not to make them issues, but because they put us in vulnerable positions in life. There was another interracial thing that happened, the show where Dick is going to get an award from an interracial group like the NAACP, and he's dyeing his socks because he didn't have black socks, and he ended up with black hands. And he couldn't wash it off, and now he's going to accept this award, and he's got black hands. It was a way to lighten or to make human the events we were going through. I mean, that was a time where busing was first coming up, and, you know, integration was just taking place and things like that. So it was like the Van Dyke Show reflected in a softening way blows that were coming to our society. At time that they did, but it was like a little storm cloud saying, hey, this is happening, you know, and it's not that big a deal. The other thing about the Van Dyke Show, there are a million other things, but one of the things was you could watch the Van Dyke Show and there was a commonality level to what you were watching, but there was always a little subtext that was kind of for a more literate awareness of what was happening. Just little references, or I'm trying to think of the direct thing, but there was just an announcement on the radio behind something that was going on, and it was about something that was happening at the museum. And it was just so esoteric, but it was there, you know, and some people picked up on it, and so you could watch the show on a number of levels. Probably one of the more interesting moments on the Van Dyke Show was the Kennedy assassination took place. And our show ran on a Wednesday to Tuesday schedule. In other words, the show would be taped in front of an audience on Tuesday night. You'd come in the next morning, read the script for the next week. We'd rewrite it and fix it. And then you'd rehearse Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. You'd have a run-through. There'd be a rewrite. Over the weekend, they'd get the script. And then we'd block and then tape it. So the Kennedy assassination stopped everything. And I guess if the show had been that night or the next day, it would have been canceled. Now, that was a big thing to cancel a show because we did 39 shows a year, and there was 13 weeks off, and there weren't all of the specials that ran. You were on a very tight schedule to finish and deliver a show for the air. So over the weekend, there was a lot of what to do and what to do. And as happens in a lot of things in life, I think, anything that goes on for 4 days, you kind of slide back into life. I remember when they had the LA riots, the first big LA riots, with the burning and all of the snipers and everything. The first day of the LA riots, everybody stayed home. The second day of the LA riots, you went out only for emergencies. The third day of the LA riots, you went out for things that were important or that you really wanted to do. And the fourth day of the LA riots, they had sniper reports on the weather and on the traffic reports, and people were going on with business. Hey, be careful. And I said if there had been a fifth day of the sniper, they'd have had a jingle that went, here's your sniper report, you know. And if you look at most things that happen, if you can get through 4 days, you're back to normal. So the Tuesday was the fourth day after the assassination. And we realized we couldn't do the show with an audience. But we did decide to do the show because there wasn't that much flexibility, and it would have caused a lot of expense. And it wasn't there was no insurance covering something like that, so it would be a total financial loss at the time. But it was the only show we ever did without an audience, and no one's mind was really on doing a comedy show. It was about getting it done because we had to. I mean, it was acted well, and there was like an asterisk in everyone's brain. And I think it was best expressed in the final scene. It was Richie's birthday, and they didn't know what to do, and it was a comment on what had happened to birthday parties for kids, how they had gotten out of control, and people were taking kids on trips and they decided just to have a party at home for his friends. And in the final scene of the party, Alan Brady brought him a pony. And the pony walked into the living room. Quite a thing to have happen. And when we shot it, no one paid any attention to the pony. It was like, oh, hey, but I mean, if that had been with an audience and our minds had been about someone walking into someone's living room with a pony, would have been incredible. But the moment, the horror of what we were all living with at that point, somehow just, oh, it's a pony, you know? So it wasn't, it's a comment on the fact that nobody was ever going to do things quite the same way again, you know? So there was a major reaction.
What do you think is the legacy of the Dick Van Dyke Show?
That you can do great without being devious or dirty. Oh.
What do you think is the legacy of the Dick Van Dyke Show?
Well, I think the legacy, if you ask it in terms of writers and what it meant to be a writer, so many, you know, it meant that start with the truth, stay human, don't reach for ugly, be vulnerable. I think that those are the things that the show was built on. When you talk to someone as an audience, what was it? It's just a never-ending funniness that no matter how long ago you see, you can still watch those things, and they're funny. I was on a panel recently, New York Television Festival, and on the panel there was, I forget his first name, Scully, who does, Mike Scully, who does the Simpsons, and there was Phil Rosenthal, who did Raymond, and there was Diane English from Murphy Brown, and myself. And at the beginning of the panel, the host said, what television shows affected you most when you were a kid? And each of them said the Dick Van Dyke Show, that had the most impact on them. I think it gave writers something to aspire to. Everybody, to this day, would love to have written for the Dick Van Dyke Show. There was a wonderful writer who passed away way too soon, Steve Gordon, who wrote and directed Arthur. And Steve Gordon worshipped the Dick Van Dyke Show. He knew every show, every line, everything. And he's not alone in the number of writers who, you know, like I can walk into a place and you're a person until you're identified, oh my God, the Dick Van Dyke Show, and what was it like, and so it just was so clean. I don't just mean that it wasn't dirty. I just mean there was a purity about humanity and human beings. Nobody was vicious. If they were vicious, it was in a way that made viciousness stupid, you know, and there was always a saving grace in everybody, including Alan Brady, who was as bad as they can be. But I think that funny is the heritage of the thing. You know, if something's funny, it's funny. You know, I often say when I'm talking to kids and stuff, if a guy slips on a banana peel building the pyramids or walking out of the White House, it's funny. The only thing that changes about funny is the wardrobe that they're wearing or the language they may be saying it in. But, you know, what's funny is when we are brought down from being too pompous about being human beings, which, after all, in my view, we're just another plant on the planet, you know. And I remember I had a meeting at NBC when, well, I'll mention names, but Warren Littlefield was first there, and I was doing a pilot, and he went on for about a half hour about why the show should do this, and why the show would be that, and why it would be this, and why it would be that, and I finally said, geez, Warren, this has really been important to me, because I've been doing this for 15 years, and until today, I never really had a theory of comedy, and now I can adopt yours, you know. And he didn't even understand that I was being facetious. But what I think comedy is it's a time warp where you take something that at the moment it's happening is tragic or serious or painful, but you go forward in time in your brain as to how you will relate it at some point in the future, trying to make it acceptable for the people who are hearing it and not wallowing in the sadness or anything. You kind of comment on the sadness from the perspective of the future, but you bring that back to the moment. And so you leave the pain, but you don't make anybody worry about it. You make it okay for them to identify with it, you make it all right to laugh at it. I remember Don Rickles, his manager, Joe Scandori, they were very good friends. And Joe Scandori was a very warm and religious Catholic, and he adored his father. And when his father died, Don, of course, was right there in the front pew with him. And Joe was crying, and he said, I can't believe Pop's gone. Don, I went up, I looked at Pop, and he's just lying there. It looks like he's sleeping. Don, would you just go up and take a look at Pop for me? And Don said, hey, Joe, I love your father. You know, I'm Jewish. We don't do that. I'm sure. And he said, oh, it would mean a lot to me, Don, to go up there. And he was crying, and he said, okay, pal. He goes up to the coffin. He looks. He comes back. And Joe said, tell the truth. Doesn't it just look like Pop is sleeping? And Don said, to tell you the truth, Joe, when I was looking at him, he gave me one of these. Joe Scandori fell off the chair. At his father's funeral, he could not stop laughing because Don had jumped ahead in that moment and done something that he would have said afterwards, kidding Joe about it. But he brought it to the moment, and it was fine. And I think that's a lot of what comedy is. I remember I saw some people, it was my ex-wife who was going to do a comedy scene that I had written in an acting class. And I went to see it. And before the acting class was from one of those ersatz method, some guy who had gone to the actor studio one day and was advertised as this guru in California who screwed up a lot of people's lives. And I went to this thing, and as they prepared for the scene, she and the guy she was doing it with, they went like this. And I knew that there was no chance for comedy to come out of that. And they did the thing, and it was very heavy. And afterwards, in commenting on it, I said, you were dead the minute you prepared like this. Comedy, you prepare like this. What in God's name are you doing to me? A comedian walks into the room feeling, what did I do? Not, oh my God. It's the same thing, but it's like, why me, you know? And it's just a positive look at negative things, I think.
Let's move on to That Girl and how that started for you.
Well, we were at Desilu, and Danny Thomas his show was there. Also, the dynasty of Thomas Leonard was centered there. And Marlowe had some interest from the people at ABC about doing a show. And quite frankly, she pretty much had her pick of who would be willing to do it, you know. And she wanted Sam and me. We had just come off the Van Dyke show, or were in the last year.
Did you know her?
In passing. And so, for family reasons to start with, we said, well, sure, we'll go see her. She was doing Barefoot in the Park in London with Daniel Massey. And so we went over to London, and we saw her, and she was wonderful, you know. She was really good. And so we said, okay, we'll take a shot at it. And so then we came back, and we had a meeting with Ed Sherrick, and Len Goldberg was working for him then. And we went in, and we sold the idea, which, you know, she had gone in with an image of what she wanted to do. And we then said, okay, we'll try that, because that was also breakthrough in its time. A single woman living alone, whether she was living in an apartment she could afford or not, it was still television.
What did she say that she wanted to do?
She wanted to do, the show was originally called Miss Independence, which came from an incident where she had her own apartment and she had aunts, and she called Danny and said, I got aunts. And he said to Rosemary, his wife, he says, hey, Miss Independence has aunts. So it was Miss Independence. So it was about a single girl who had left home. Her parents didn't approve of it, and so forth and so on. But that's where it started. And so that was the show, and we developed it into what her career was, who her family was, where they lived, all of this kind of stuff. And the title is actually the result of what my parents referred to my sister as. They never talked about her in the first person. It was always, that girl is going to drive me crazy. Do you know what that girl did today? Wait till you see what that girl is doing. So that was where That Girl came from. In the beginning, when Sam and I did the pilot, there were 3 separate dimensions to the character, or many more, but there were 3 classifications. She was a daughter, she was an aspiring actress, and she was whatever she happened to be, what the reality of her life was. So we wanted to show those 3 things. So we wrote this little introductory thing where her parents were on the phone with her, and her father picked up the picture of her. This is before you ever saw her. Picked up the picture of her in her cap and gown and said, I don't know what I'm going to do about that girl, right? Then there was her agent who was trying to sell her to somebody, and he had a headshot of her, which was very glamorous, and I'm telling you, the one you're looking for is that girl. And then there was a scene in a restaurant where a guy said, "Where's my waitress?" And the busboy said, "That girl." And the camera zoomed in, and we had accomplished the thing. Everybody said, "Oh, that was great." And I said, "Well, yeah, well, you can't do it every week, but I mean, it did accomplish it." But well, it became one of the more remembered signatures in television. That girl, you know. So that was the start of it. Now, I am an enemy of research. I don't believe in it. The best research is what you feel inside. And one of the reasons I believe that is that after the pilot of That Girl, the network wanted to fire Ted Bessel. In fact, they insisted on it. They said he didn't test well and he couldn't be in the show. Now, we had come to realize that the reason that Teddy didn't test well was we had created a schizophrenic character that could be neither his job nor his role as boyfriend. He was her agent. So as her agent, he had to be going this way with her life, and as her boyfriend, at the time, guys were not into being supportive of career and stuff, he had to be going this way. Plus the fact an agent, in everybody's perception, is some kind of jerk. So we gave up on a funny character, and so they were relating not to Ted Bessel, but to what we had given him to play. But they wouldn't hear that at all. They never look underneath. They only say they don't like him, you know. So we stood firm. Now, unfortunately, we lost Harold Gould as her original father because flat out to them he was too Jewish, and at that time you couldn't do that. And we fought for that too.
Was that an issue throughout that period in your career?
Oh yeah. Well, yeah, if you're going to make, I mean, you didn't want to make it obviously anything. You know, Italian was all right, but I mean, it was never stated as such. They talked about, well, he wasn't right, he wasn't this, he wasn't. The fact is that Harold Gould is one of the finer actors around, and he was great in that. So we weren't going to win that battle, but we fought, and I said, I won't do, you know, he said, we won't do the show if Ted Bessel isn't in it. And what happened is we rewrote it, we made him, he had a job in a magazine. Ted Bessel went on for 5 years to be everybody's favorite co-star. Every girl in America wanted a boyfriend like Donald. So if you went with the research, you'd have gotten rid of a thing for a totally wrong reason, you know. Now the funny thing that nobody seems to know is that the guy who replaced him as her agent was George Carlin, who at that time was a young actor-comedian, the most uptight person you ever met. Good, funny, but very proper. And on the 6th show, he didn't show up. He disappeared. No one knew where or what. We immediately hired Ronnie Schell. And George Carlin emerged as George Carlin about 2 years later. He had had a total meltdown of who he wanted to be and who he was being portrayed as, and he changed who he was in the course of that. I actually haven't seen it, any of the 6 earlier episodes with him in it, but that's who it was.
What was Marlo Thomas's day-to-day involvement on the show?
Total. Marlo Thomas, who I love, is one of the, you know, I referred to her as the velvet steamroller. She is totally warm and giving, and when she wants it, she's going to get it, you know, and a lot of people bridle, and most times her instincts about herself are right. Her instincts maybe on the story point or other, that you can fight on, but when she feels something deeply, I always listened very carefully to it because I knew, like Marlo's clothes on the show. Everybody said, how could she afford those clothes? That wasn't what it was about. She became a role model. And if I once said, if Marlo found out that the hemline had changed in Paris that day, she would go back and have all of her clothes altered, and you'd have to reshoot the scene because but the fact is, she was right. It was one of the things about the show that young girls loved, was the fashion aspect of it. Nobody ever, I mean, what's her name? With the fashion, Loretta Young, she came in with those outfits and stuff. But for a young girl to be fashionable and chic and on top of that was all new stuff. And it was a very important part of the show. She was in the driver's seat. There's no question about it. I never knuckled under to her, but I never ignored her either. And if you were gonna go in a certain way that she wasn't happy with, you had to prove to her why. I mean, you know, it was her show. She owned the production company, and that was it. And we've maintained a very good relationship over the years. And you know, another thing that I think is important, if you go to Las Vegas, you can't lose what you don't put on the table. And in business and in life, you can't lose your manhood if that isn't what you're fighting for in a given situation. And too often, especially in those days dealing with a woman, people would bridle, guys would bridle and think it was all about who's the guy and who's in charge and you can't let a woman. Well, I never felt that way. I just felt, okay, we're here and it's about this. And so I was not protecting any vital organs other than, you know, just what the show is about. I remember when we first went to do location shooting in New York the first season, and everybody was concerned about cost of things. And Marlo had a hairdresser and a makeup man who she really depended on. She really trusted them, and they knew what she wanted to look like, and so she was very comfortable and safe with them. And when we were going to New York, they were in the budget to take from LA to New York, and it was a really big extra expense, the travel, the per diem, all that stuff. And they said, well, we can get someone in New York. And the fact is, all the shots in New York were long. You know, there was her getting out of a cab, going into a building, you know, there were those generic shots. But she was adamant about that, and everybody said, we have to hold the line here. We can't let her make a decision that's going to end. Everybody was just fighting her. And I said, well, let's see, there's got to be a reason for this. And I talked to her, and I said, you know, Marlo, there's no long shots. There's only long shots. You're never going to, why do you need this? She says, because all the time I'm there, ABC is bringing people around, and they're doing magazine articles, and they're doing interviews, and I want to look great. So I went to ABC. I said, you know, we are incurring an expense that we really don't need, and it's because you're bringing people around, and it's valuable for the show, and we'd like you to pick up the difference between what it would be for so-and-so. And they did. So it never cost us another penny. But people involved in the show said to me, you gave in to her. I said, I didn't give in to anything. It didn't cost us anything. She got what she wanted. We got what we wanted. I wasn't out to win. I was out to find out why it was so important to her and deal with it on that level.
Stop there to change the tape.